Okay, so you know how we're always hearing about the UK government,
Yeah.
in the news and just in passing?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but I've always been a little bit curious about like how it all actually works.
Right.
Like what are the pieces
Yeah,
and how do they all fit together?
totally.
So that is what we're diving into today,
Yeah.
like the real foundations of the British system.
Yeah. And you found some really fascinating material for us to dig into here.
Yeah.
We're going to look at, what it actually means for the UK to be both a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy at the same time.
Right.
I mean, it sounds kind of complicated when you just say it like that.
Yeah.
We're also going to be taking a look at the very interesting and kind of misunderstood unwritten Constitution.
Yeah, that's the big
We're
one.
going to try to unpack that one.
Yeah.
Explore the historical significance of the Magna Carta, and even touch on the recent transition of the monarchy with, Queen Elizabeth passing away and now King Charles on the throne.
Right. Yeah. So much change happening.
So really what we want to do today is not just define these terms for you,
Yeah.
but actually show you how they actually work in practice.
Right. Get into the nuts and bolts.
And why they've evolved the way they have over, centuries.
Right.
So let's maybe start with the UK as a constitutional monarchy.
Right.
I mean, what does that even mean in terms of like day-to-day operations of the government?
Yeah. Constitutional monarchy, it sounds very grand and very official.
Right.
But what does it actually mean, like on the ground?
Well, I mean, essentially it means that while the UK obviously does have a king as the head of state,
Right.
King Charles III,
Right.
his power is not absolute.
Okay.
And it's very much defined and limited by the Constitution and the laws of the country.
So there are rules even for the king.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like back in the day where, a monarch could just kind of do whatever they want.
Right. Make laws on a whim.
Right. Basically.
Or just decide, government policy because they feel like it.
Exactly. And that's really the opposite of a constitutional monarchy.
Okay.
So to answer your question, no, the king is not like, sitting there drafting legislation or deciding on, specific policies.
Okay.
I mean, at least not in a direct, like overtly political way.
Right. He's not the one, calling the shots on a day-to-day basis.
No, not at all.
Okay.
In the UK, the monarch's role is really, I guess, to reign,
Okay.
but not really to rule in a hands-on sort of way.
Interesting. So he's a figurehead.
To a certain extent, yes.
Okay.
He performs very important official duties,
Okay.
but the real power to actually govern lies with the elected government.
Okay. So that's what it means, which will say the UK is a democracy.
Exactly.
It's not the king making all the decisions.
No, it means ultimately the people have the power through the elected officials.
Right.
And that brings us very nicely, actually, to our next topic.
Okay.
The UK as a parliamentary democracy.
Right.
So how does that work in practice?
Yeah.
What does that actually mean for you and me as citizens?
Right. As people living in the UK.
Yeah. So in a parliamentary democracy, like we have, the government is chosen by the people through elections.
Right. The classic vote.
Yeah, exactly. And those elected representatives then form parliament,
Okay.
which is the body responsible for making laws and those big decisions that affect the whole nation.
Okay. So let's break down that election process.
Sure.
Because we have elections all the time in the UK.
Mhm.
What are we actually voting for?
Right. So we have general elections and they happen at least every 5 years.
Right.
And when you go to vote, you're actually choosing a member of parliament or an MP
Right.
to represent your local area
Okay.
in the House of Commons.
Right.
And most of these MPs belong to political parties, which is, a key part of how this whole system works.
Okay. So it's not just a bunch of random people with no affiliation.
It would be chaos,
Right.
if everybody was just in there doing their own thing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Like a free-for-all.
Exactly. So these parties play a big role.
Right. So then how do we decide which party actually gets to run the show?
So after the election, the party that ends up with the most seats in the House of Commons,
Right.
so meaning they've got the largest number of MPs that have been elected,
Okay.
that's the party that gets to form the government.
Okay.
And then the leader of that winning party
Yeah.
becomes the prime minister.
Okay. So it's not like the king is choosing his buddies
No.
to run the country.
It's all based on the results of the election.
Okay. So it really is based on what we, the people, decide.
It is.
All right. So we've got a king, but the real power center is Parliament.
Yes.
Okay. And they get their power from us.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now let's get into this thing that's always really confused me.
Okay.
The UK's unwritten constitution.
Right.
Because our sources are saying that's not actually the right way to describe it.
Yeah, it is a bit of a misnomer.
Okay. So what's the issue with that term?
Well, it can be pretty misleading because when people hear unwritten,
Yeah.
they think there are literally no constitutional documents.
Right. Like there's nothing written down.
Yeah. And that's just not true.
Okay. So what's a better way to put it?
So the more accurate term is uncodified.
Uncodified.
Yeah.
Okay.
And what that means is that unlike many other countries, like the US,
Yeah.
the UK doesn't have that single all-encompassing document.
Okay.
It's just labeled the Constitution.
Right. Like with a big capital C.
Yeah.
Okay.
That lays out all of the, ground rules and laws and principles for how the country's run.
Oh, okay. So it's not all in one convenient place.
It's not, no, it can be a bit of a treasure hunt.
Okay. So if it's not all in one big book,
Yeah.
where do all these rules come from then?
Well, they come from a whole bunch of different places.
Okay.
One source is what we call statute law,
Okay.
and these are acts of parliament.
Okay.
So laws that have been passed by our elected representatives
Okay.
in the legislature.
Okay. So these are written down. Okay. So there are some written laws.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and some big ones that are super important,
Okay.
like the Parliament Acts,
Okay.
the Human Rights Act,
Okay.
the Scotland Act.
Yeah.
All of these have constitutional significance.
Right. Okay. So written laws from Parliament.
Right.
What else?
Then we've got what's called common law.
Okay.
And this is law that's basically developed over centuries
Okay.
through decisions made in court cases.
Okay. So judges are involved.
Yes. So when judges make rulings, those precedents can establish legal principles
Right.
that actually carry constitutional weight.
Okay. So it's kind of like how tradition builds up over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
So think about those landmark court cases
Yeah.
that have, established really important legal principles
Okay.
over time,
Yeah.
like the principle of judicial review,
Okay.
which basically means that the courts can, examine and kind of check the lawfulness of actions taken by public bodies.
So they can make sure the government is following the rules too.
Exactly.
Well-
And that's a fundamental part of how our whole legal system works and how it interacts with the government.
Wow. So it's not just written laws, it's also this history of legal tradition and judicial decisions.
Yeah, and there's more.
Okay, hit me.
So the source also mentions these things called conventions.
Conventions.
Yes, and they sound very unwritten, don't they?
Yeah, they sound very, very unwritten.
Yeah, well, they are.
Okay.
And they're basically unwritten rules and practices
Okay.
that aren't legally enforced, by the courts,
Okay.
but everybody just kind of knows them
Okay.
and follows them.
So they're like the rules of the game that everybody agrees on.
Exactly. And they're considered binding, in how the political system works.
Interesting.
So a prime example is a convention that the prime minister has to be the leader of the political party
Right.
that has the majority in the House of Commons.
Okay.
There's no actual law written down that says that,
Huh.
but it's just how it's done.
Right. Everyone understands that's how it works.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Everybody just gets it.
Okay. That's so interesting.
And another one is, the monarch giving royal assent to bills
Okay.
that have been passed by Parliament.
Okay.
That's a formality, but it's rooted in convention.
Right.
It's almost like the political equivalent of
Yeah.
unwritten social rules.
Yeah. Like we all know not to like talk over each other.
Yeah, exactly. Or, interrupt constantly.
Yeah. Or wear pajamas to a wedding.
Exactly.
Right.
Everyone just understands it.
Okay.
So those are conventions.
It's so interesting.
And then we also have what are called works of authority.
Okay.
And these are kind of historical texts and legal commentaries
Okay.
that are considered to be authoritative guides
Okay.
on constitutional matters.
Right.
So they're not law themselves,
Okay.
but they're really important for understanding how things work.
Right. Like the rule book.
Yeah. And a good example is Erskine May's treatise
Okay.
on parliamentary practice. Like that's a big one
Okay.
that a lot of people refer to.
Okay.
And then historically, of course, when the UK was a member of the European Union,
Right.
EU law also played a significant role
Okay.
as a source of constitutional law.
Right.
So it's a very, mixed bag, as you can see.
Yeah. Wow. So it's written laws, it's judge-made law, it's unwritten rules, it's these influential commentaries.
Yeah.
It seems like kind of a lot.
It is a bit all over the place.
Yeah, and kind of disorganized in a way.
Well, that's part of why it's developed this way.
Okay, so why didn't they just make a constitution when they were putting all this together?
Yeah, well, the sources point to a few reasons for this.
Okay.
One big one is that, the UK's political system
Yeah.
has always been very gradual
Okay.
and evolutionary in how it's developed. It's
Right.
not like, some countries where they had a revolution
Right.
And then they started fresh with a brand new constitution.
Right, like wiping the slate clean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The UK system just kind of grew organically over centuries, adding layers and layers.
Yeah, like a layer cake of government.
It is a bit like that.
Okay.
So there was never really a point where they sat down and said, okay,
Right.
let's write a constitution.
Yeah, let's make this from scratch.
Yeah, no, they never had that kind of moment.
So unlike the US.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And another really important factor is this principle of parliamentary sovereignty.
Okay.
And this is the idea that Parliament is the top dog,
Okay.
like the ultimate legal authority,
Okay.
and it can create or repeal any law.
Okay, so Parliament has the final say.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
And this has made it kind of hard to establish a set of, fixed constitutional rules
Okay.
in one document, because that could be seen as trying to bind future parliaments.
Right, so they don't want to limit themselves.
Exactly. And if Parliament is supreme, like in theory, it could just change any part of a written constitution.
Right, they could just vote and say, we don't like this rule anymore.
Exactly.
So a written constitution is almost like
Yeah.
putting handcuffs on Parliament?
You could see it that way.
Right.
And then there's also this preference for flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah.
Having this uncodified system
Yeah.
allows things to adapt
Right.
to changing circumstances
Okay.
much
Yeah.
more easily than a written constitution.
Okay.
They can just pass new laws.
Right.
Judges can make new interpretations
Yeah.
without having to go through that whole complex process of amending a written constitution.
Right. Yeah, like in the US, it's really hard to change the Constitution.
Exactly.
Okay.
And historically, the UK has always been quite pragmatic.
Okay.
They like to address specific issues as they pop up
Okay.
rather than sticking to some grand theoretical design.
So just dealing with things as they happen?
Yeah, that's been their style.
Yeah, okay. But this kind of unwritten nature must have its pros and cons.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? Flexibility is great, but not having everything written down could be a bit of a nightmare sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the debate that's going on.
Okay.
Some people think this flexibility is great. Yeah. It allows for gradual adaptation.
Mm.
But other people are concerned about the lack of clarity
Right.
and maybe weaker protections for rights
Okay.
than you would have with, a nice, clear constitution.
Right, because you know exactly what your rights are.
Exactly.
So this uncodified system is kind of a double-edged sword.
It is.
Okay, so let me just repeat this to make sure I understand.
Okay.
It's not that the UK has no written constitution at all.
Right.
It's just that the rules are scattered around in a bunch of different places.
Yeah.
Laws, court decisions, records of how they do things, and those unwritten conventions we talked about.
Mhm.
So it's not all in one handy document.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's unwritten in the sense that it's not codified,
Right.
but it's actually mostly documented.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it.
Good.
Now let's look at this idea of a convention.
Okay.
Like an unwritten rule.
Right.
The source uses the prime minister as an example.
Okay. Good example.
So how does that show us how this unwritten constitution actually works?
So think about it. The role and the powers of the prime minister,
Yeah.
they're not clearly defined
Okay.
in one single law.
Okay.
There's no prime minister act that says, this is what you can do, this is what you can't do.
Right.
It's all kind of based on these conventions and established practices.
So it's like everybody just knows what the PM can do.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay.
So the main convention is that the monarch appoints as prime minister
Yeah.
whoever can command the confidence of the House of Commons.
Right.
So basically, who has the support of the majority of MPs?
Okay.
And usually that just means the leader of the party
Yeah.
with the most seats,
Okay.
but it's not a hard and fast rule.
Okay, so someone can become really powerful based on this unwritten understanding.
They can and they do.
Wow. That's a lot of power resting on something that's not even written down.
Yeah, it really shows you how important those unwritten elements can be.
Right. Because everyone just follows the convention.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it also highlights how flexible the system can be.
Right.
The role of the PM has changed so much over the years
Yeah.
without needing formal legal changes.
It's all been through these conventions and practices.
Exactly.
So fascinating. But it does make you wonder, with all this flexibility, could things get a bit blurry sometimes?
Oh, for sure.
Right.
It's a balancing act.
Okay, now I want to go back to history for a second.
Okay.
Because a lot of countries have these big formal constitutions.
Yeah.
Why doesn't the UK?
Well, the sources explain that it's often because of big historical events,
Okay.
like revolutions
Right.
or wars
Yeah.
or, a country gaining independence.
Right.
Like these huge turning points.
Okay.
they often lead to countries saying, okay,
Right.
we need a fresh start.
Yeah, we need a whole new set of rules.
Exactly. We need a constitution to lay everything out.
Okay.
But the UK hasn't really had those kinds of dramatic breaks.
Right. They haven't had to like reinvent themselves.
Not really, no.
Okay.
Their history has been relatively stable.
Okay.
Things have changed gradually,
Right.
so they never really needed to go back to the drawing board.
Okay. So they just kind of kept building on what they had.
Pretty much, yeah.
But the source did mention one exception.
Oh, right.
Something about Cromwell.
Yes. So in the 17th century, after the English Civil War,
Okay.
they actually did have a written constitution for a short time.
Really?
Yeah, it was called the Instrument of Government,
Okay.
and it was under Oliver Cromwell.
Right.
But that was a very unique situation,
Okay.
and it didn't last once the monarchy was restored.
So it was like a temporary experiment.
It was. Yeah. It was kind of a blip on the radar.
So they tried it out and decided it wasn't for them.
Well, the monarchy decided that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you mentioned some downsides to having this uncodified system.
Yeah.
What are the biggest challenges?
Well, one of the biggest ones is just figuring out what the Constitution actually is, because it's spread out over so many different sources.
Yeah.
It can be hard to know for sure what's constitutional and what's not.
Okay. So you could have a situation where people are arguing over
Oh, yeah, all the time.
what the Constitution actually says
It happens a lot.
because it's not clear.
Yeah, it's like trying to put together a puzzle, but you're missing some pieces.
Yeah. And you don't have the picture on the box.
Exactly.
Okay. And then another problem is that it seems like it would be really easy to change.
Right. Yeah, that's another big concern.
Because if it's not all written down in one special document,
Yeah,
Parliament could just vote to change the rules whenever they want.
they could, and that worries some people,
Yeah, I can see why.
because what if they change the rules in a way that's not very good?
Right. Or takes away people's rights.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's scary.
And in countries with those written constitutions,
Yeah.
usually they make it really hard to change the rules.
Right.
You know, they might need like a supermajority
Oh,
or even a public vote to make any changes to the Constitution.
right. So it's like a big lock on the door.
Yeah, and that's kind of missing in the UK system.
Right.
So that's a big part of the debate.
Yeah. So it's really about finding the right balance
Yeah,
between flexibility and security.
exactly.
Okay, now I want to talk about the monarch.
Okay.
Because the source describes the UK system as kind of old-fashioned in some ways.
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
Well, it's not that they're saying it's inefficient or anything.
Okay.
It's more about highlighting the long history and tradition
Right.
that are behind the whole system.
Okay.
It's a system that's been around for a really long time,
Yeah.
and it's built on these, very old institutions.
Right, like the monarchy.
Exactly. And at the core of that is the constitutional monarchy.
Okay, so we've established that the monarch has limited power.
Right.
But how limited is it really?
Very limited. Like
Yeah.
really the Constitution.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the broad sense. All the laws and customs and practices,
Yeah.
they make it very clear that the monarch can't just act on their own personal whims.
Okay, so the king can't just wake up and decide to do whatever he wants?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
Or make unilateral political decisions.
Okay.
And that's the big difference between a constitutional monarchy
Right.
and an absolute monarchy,
Okay.
where the ruler has unlimited power.
Yeah. So the king in the UK is bound by the rules, just like everybody else.
Exactly.
Okay. And the monarchy has been around for over 1,000 years.
Right. Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, that's wild. And the sources point to the Magna Carta
Yeah.
as this really key turning point.
It's a huge deal.
Okay, so why is the Magna Carta so important?
Well, before the Magna Carta was signed,
Yeah.
kings in England basically acted like they were above the law.
Okay, so they can do whatever they wanted.
Pretty much,
Ah.
yeah. And the Magna Carta, which was sealed in 1215,
Okay.
was the first time that a king,
Okay.
in this case King John, was forced by his barons
Oh, okay.
to agree to a set of principles that limited his own power.
Wow. So even way back then, people were trying to hold the king accountable?
Yeah, you could say that.
Wow, that's fascinating.
It was a big step towards the idea that even the most powerful person
Yeah.
has to follow the rules.
Okay.
So it wasn't democracy like we have today,
Right.
but it was a step in that direction.
Okay, so now we have King Charles
Yeah.
inheriting this whole long history
Right.
and all these traditions.
It's quite a legacy.
It is, yeah. So apart from all the ceremonial stuff,
Yeah.
what are his actual responsibilities?
Yeah. So obviously a lot of what the monarch does is very ceremonial.
Right, all the waving and the parades.
Yeah, exactly. Hosting state visits, going to events, representing the UK,
Yeah.
being a symbol of national unity.
Right.
But they also have some official duties.
What?
Well, every year, they formally open Parliament.
Okay.
They also grant royal assent to legislation,
Okay.
which is basically a formality now, based on convention.
Yeah.
And they appoint the prime minister.
Right.
But again, they have to follow the convention
Right.
of choosing the leader who has the confidence of the House of Commons.
Okay, so it's not like he just picks whoever he likes.
No.
Okay, so lots of symbolic and formal things.
Yeah.
But he's not actually involved in the nitty-gritty of government policy.
Not really, no.
Okay, now let's talk more about the Magna Carta,
Okay.
because the source calls it one of the most important documents in English history.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It's from June 1215,
Right.
and it means Great Charter in Latin.
Yeah. It's a very important piece of parchment.
Okay, so what does this Great Chart actually say?
So it's got 63 clauses.
63.
63.
Ugh.
And they cover a bunch of different issues
Okay.
that were important back in the 13th century.
Okay.
So some of them deal with the rights and privileges of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
You know, they wanted to make sure the church was protected. And a lot of the clauses were about addressing the barons' complaints
Right.
about King John.
Okay.
You know, they thought he was being unfair
Okay.
and they wanted to be treated better
Okay.
according to the laws of the time.
Right. So it's kind of like a negotiation.
It was.
Okay.
Yeah. They were basically saying, hey, King, you need to follow the rules too.
Okay.
And then there were also some very important clauses that laid out principles
Okay.
for a more just legal system.
Okay.
You know, like early ideas about due process
Okay.
and legal protections for people.
So it wasn't just about the barons then.
No, it had some wider implications.
Okay. So even though it was about this power struggle with the barons,
Yeah,
there were some bigger principles at play.
there were.
Okay.
And some of those have had a lasting impact.
Right. So the idea that even the king is subject to the law,
That was huge.
that's like a fundamental principle of democracy,
It is.
right? And it all started way back then with the Magna Carta.
Let's start there. Yeah.
That's incredible.
It was a big moment.
Okay. And now the Magna Carta is this global symbol of freedom and the rule of law.
Right. It's become much bigger than just a document about 13th century England.
Yeah, it represents something much bigger.
Exactly.
And it's amazing how this one document has had such a huge influence.
It really has.
Okay, so let's move on to something much more recent.
Yeah.
The transition of the monarchy
Yeah.
after Queen Elizabeth passed away.
A big moment in history.
It was, yeah, so what happened right away after she died?
So the very first thing they did was officially proclaim Charles as the new king,
Okay.
King Charles III.
Right.
And that happened immediately.
Okay, so like right after the Queen passed away.
Yeah, like that same day.
Wow, so there's no gap in power?
No, the power passes directly to the heir.
Okay.
So there's no uncertainty
Okay.
or, period of instability.
Okay.
It's all very smooth and seamless.
Okay, and then choosing the name Charles.
Yeah.
What's the significance of that?
Well, it's his name,
Right.
but it also connects him.
Yeah.
Symbolically
Okay.
to previous monarchs who have had that name.
Okay, so it emphasizes the continuity
Exactly.
of the monarchy.
Right, okay.
And then there were some changes in titles within the royal family.
Right, yeah, so Prince William and Catherine.
Yeah.
They got some new titles.
Okay.
They're now the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and Cambridge,
Okay.
which reflects William's new position as the heir to the throne.
Okay.
And Camilla,
Yeah.
Charles's wife,
Mm-hmm.
she became the queen consort,
Okay.
which acknowledges her role as the king's wife.
Right.
So everyone got a bit of a promotion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so then they had that big ceremony.
The Accession Council.
Yeah. Who are all those people in the Accession Council?
So it's a pretty big group.
Okay.
You've got members of the Privy Council,
Okay.
who are basically senior advisors to the monarch.
Okay.
You've got MPs,
Okay.
you've got peers, both hereditary and life peers.
Okay.
Senior civil servants, representatives from Commonwealth countries.
Wow. So it's like a who's who of the UK.
Yeah, basically. And they're all there to formally proclaim the new sovereign.
Okay, so it's a very official event.
It is.